Recently, I made a video on trim textures for modular environments, and I got some interesting questions in the comments related to decals. So I wanted to dedicate this video to talk about my process of creating decals for that same environment. This environment is made with trim textures, and it's necessary for the trim textures to be clean because they're going to be repeating very much. If I add dirt, stains into these panels, then you're going to see those same dirt and stain patterns repeating throughout the environment. And this is the reason why I add decals to the environment after the fact. You can see some on the floor, some stains on the wall, here as well. So I'm just going to talk about my process of making these, and hopefully you find it useful. Just a quick search on Google gives me interesting references of potential dirt patterns. Now if I search for dirt patterns on glass, you can see how potentially you can have a dirt decal that has more staining on it, and that would be interesting as well. In order to create the alpha patterns for these decals, I'm going to go to Substance Designer. It comes loaded with many noise patterns that you can combine to create that mask that will become that decal. I'm going to start off by dropping in some of these patterns and combining them, and to see what kind of effect I'm going to get. I'm going to start off with larger patterns first, and then eventually I'm going to work my way towards the more detailed small patterns. So I'm going to use a blend node, and let's try min darken. It's a small effect, but what I'm thinking of doing is adjusting it with levels, and this way the final effect would be more pronounced. So I'm going to double click on the node at the end, and then go back, single click, and adjust the levels on this one. So I'm looking to eliminate a lot of the detail and make it mostly dark. Now I'm going to introduce one of the grunge patterns. One of the things that I like about these patterns is that they do have the setting called brush pattern on the right. And if you notice, when I increase it, it creates an alpha on the edge. And this is going to be very useful because the decal needs to limit itself to the inner parts of the texture. So I'm going to blend these again. And then try min darken. This one introduces some very interesting sharp features, but in some cases, if the features that's introducing are too sharp, you can always add a blur. So I'm going to try this one, HQ grayscale, connected, but then lower it so it's not as intense. And this is starting to look promising. I think it just needs a little more speckled patterns, something to break up the cloudiness of this decal. Like here, this one has small spots that we can try out. Just perhaps tile them. Actually, I'm noticing that these are a little too sharp for me, so I'm going to remove it. I'm going to try this one instead. Again, I'm going to try the scratch version. Yeah, this one looks okay. I'm just adding a little bit of detail, but not much. So by lowering the opacity, you get some of the scratch patterns, but it's fairly noticeable. One thing that I want to do to this texture is to adjust the levels. That way it's not as dark. And then I'm going to distort it using a directional warp. This grunge leaks texture, it just adds a very perfect amount of breakup that makes the pattern look really interesting now. It has large details, small details, blurry details, soft details. And I think this is exactly what we're looking for. I'm going to make 2 more examples so we have 3 in total. Feel free to experiment with this process, combining noise patterns in different ways to create your own masks. And these are my results. So the second pattern is quite different than the first, it's much less cloudy and it has more definition. You can see here I combined 2 different grunge maps, added a directional blur, that combined it again with a different grunge map, blurred it again, introduce some texture to it, that way to soften and blend everything together. Adjusted the levels, and then added a directional warp. The third mask is the one that took me the longest. It's a stain decal that is meant to be coming from the top. And the way I achieve this is by using a noise that already has a directionality to it, apply a blur, and then use a dirt gradient in order to remove the bottom part of the texture. Afterwards, I added another blur, outer levels, and then combined it with another grunge. And you see the result is much more random now. But still, there's a lot of detail that I want to get rid of, so I introduced another dirt gradient, rotated it, applied a blur, combined it with a slightly different version of this grunge map, adjusted the levels, and you see the result here has more black than white. Then I blended it with the previous version, and you have some interesting vertical patterns, a cloudy and misty feel, and it's mostly black at the bottom. Another thing that I did is introduce these grunge maps and then adjusted the pattern value, that way it clamps into the center of the texture. And then I transformed it to stretch it out and place it exactly where I want it. Applied a directional blur, and I did that a couple of times in order to create a very interesting pattern of 3 different textures. And the end result of that was blended into the previous. Adjusted the levels, and then I blended it into some other noise patterns in order to soften the details and make everything look really cohesive. Added a directional warp, then blended it with a noise texture called black and white spots. Adds a little more definition. Blurred it a little bit, and then added the outer levels. And this is the end result. So I'm going to export them now by adding 3 different outputs. By clicking on the graph, I can export the outputs. In Photoshop, I have the 3 masks that we're going to be using for the decals. What I'm going to do, I'm going to paste each one into a separate RGB channel. This one goes on the red. Then I'll paste this one on the green. And this one on the blue. Now in Photoshop, I'm navigating to the red channel, and I'm just gonna paint the edges. I'm holding shift, that way it just creates a vertical line. I'm gonna increase the brush size and just taper it off a bit. The texture is now imported into Unreal. And if I open it, I can verify that each channel has a different mask. So now I'm gonna test out the new setup by duplicating one of the existing decals. And then replacing the masks. This is the new one that we just imported. And here we can isolate the channel we want to use. I'm going to use the red channel. I'm going to minimize this one in case I want to make some changes once I drop it into the scene. Let's try it out here. By default, when you drop in the decals, they're very thick. I recommend keeping the volumes as thin as possible. It's better for memory. And there you go. You have a brand new decal. So we can always go back and edit the material instance and see the live updates on the scene. If you want it to be lighter, you can always downplay the intensity. Want it to be stronger. So I'm going to duplicate another decal, this time one of the dirt patterns. I'll drop it in, that way we can see it as we change it. Let's adjust the scale. Open up the material and change the mask. This is the new one that we just created. Let's see what the blue channel is doing. I like it. It creates a very soft, cloudy feel. Very interesting dirt pattern. And of course it can be adjusted. You change the colors and the intensity, the roughness, the metalness. Let's try out the different mask. It's much more defined. It almost looks eroded. It complements the edges of the trim texture. I would say it's working. I went ahead and duplicated the dirt decal in order to have both masks. Gonna drop it into the environment and adjust the scales. So here's one of the decals represented. I'm gonna copy paste it in order to keep the settings and then replace it with the other one. And yeah, this one's much softer, it's cloudier. Creates a very interesting effect. Now let's try the stain on the wall. I'm finding the stain to be too intense, so I'm just gonna lower the intensity. Perhaps 1 instead of 2. Yep, this is much better. Much more subtle. And of course, you can have different versions of the same decal, one that is more intense, one that is a different color. The material setup itself is very simple. I'm going to go through it now. So this is a material instance, and it's referencing a master material. I have one for the moss, another one for the dirt. But for the example, I'm going to create a new material. I'm going to name it Dirt 2. And I'm going to keep the original one as a reference. As you can see, it doesn't have many nodes, but we can go through the process of making it. That way you can see how it works behind the scenes. Let's start off by adding parameters for the roughness and for the metalness. I'm going to hold 1 and then press. And then I just created 2 values. Right click on them, convert them to parameters. Let's put metalness as a name for this one. And then roughness. The roughness obviously is very reflective right now, so I'm gonna open it and then change it to 0.75. Let's drop in our new texture. Also convert it into parameter. In this way, in the material you can always swap for a different mask while keeping the same setup. In the material instance, we should be able to choose which mask we want to use. And for that, I'm going to drop a mask parameter. Static component, mask parameter. Let's label this as mask chooser. And then connect the RGB. By default is using the red channel, but we can always change it later. I'm going to set this to the side. I'm going to give this material some texture. I'm going to start off with the mud texture that I already have. Feel free to use any texture that you currently have. I'm going to isolate one of the channels. And then multiply it by a value. Let's preview it by plugging it to the base color. Let's try 2.5. Let me see how the blue channel looks like. Which one gives the best result? I'm going to use the red channel. So in order to adjust the tiling in the material instance, I'm going to add a texture coordinate. You can actually multiply this texture coordinate by a value. So I put a multiply node, a value, and then convert it to a parameter. You can call this tiling. Let's try that. Number 3. Of course, it's black and white, and we don't want that. So I'm going to use a lerp and plug this to the alpha. I'm going to use 2 different colors. So by holding the number 3, I'll click on the screen. We have color 1, and then do it again, color 2. And I'll plug this to A, and plug this to B. Right click on both of these and then convert them to parameters. So let's call this base color A. And the second one we can just call base color B. Of course, right now they're black. I'm gonna give this a light brown. And if the color doesn't show up properly, that means that we need to adjust the values of the alpha. To the second color, I'm gonna give it a darker brown. Perhaps more of a reddish tint. Let's try that. Right now, the texture is leaning too much on the yellow color. This is better. I'm gonna adjust the multiplication on this value. And the higher it is, you're gonna see that it shows both colors more equally. It also introduces more detail, so I might just want to knock that off a little bit by introducing a power node. Perhaps going below 1. This looks more balanced. Of course, we can change the colors once we have it in the scene to make sure they're complementary. So I'm going to change the material type to a deferred decal and then change it to translucent. Now we have an opacity value that we can use to plug in our mask. Change the preview. We want to be able to adjust the intensity of the mask in the material instance. So for that, I'm going to drop in a multiply and then a value. And change this to a parameter. You can call it mask intensity. For now, we can just set it to 1. We can create another one called mask contrast by using a power node. Duplicating this one. And again, leaving it at 1. We can adjust these later on. Another thing I want to do is just drop in the normal map. It's going to give the texture more definition. So the same mud, and apply the same UV modifiers, and apply it to the normal. I opened up a new map called Galaxy Example Blueprints. This one's much more simple, and we can try out a new materials here. So if I right click on the master, then select Create Material Instance. And just call it Test Dirt for now. And then drop it into the environment. Open it up. And of course we have all the options that we set up already. Like the mask contrast, the intensity, the metalness, roughness, the tiling of it. I'm going to choose the green channel. And I'm going to play around with the colors to see what works. Right now the colors are very light, as you can see. But if I zoom in, we should be able to see the tiling texture with a normal map as well. Start off by making it much darker. I'm going to move this off screen and edit it. Liking that color is a little more complementary to the environment. And perhaps I'll tile the dirt texture a bit more. So by default, the tiling is set to 3. I'm gonna put it at try 6. Yep. So it's only when you get close that you start seeing more of that pattern. Gonna duplicate it so I can use the other pattern. Let's try the blue channel. And drop it in. Of course, can open it up and adjust the intensity of it. The intensity is set to 1 right now. Let's see if I set it to 2. It's much more pronounced. I'm gonna leave it at 1.5. And do the same thing for the first one. $1.5. Gonna duplicate this. Then call it stain test. Or test stain. Open it up. Let's try out green colors instead for this one. So it looks like moss. Going to be using the red channel for this. Intensity can be lesser for this one. Let's try 1. Let's test it out here. Rotate it and scale it into place. It works. Of course, we can always go back and adjust it now that we have it in our environment. Perhaps make the color be darker. Increase the intensity a bit. Thank you very much for watching. So to summarize, we created 3 different masks using Substance Designer. We exported them into Photoshop to combine them into a single texture and made some minor edits after that, then imported that into Unreal in order to drive the patterns that we use for our decals. And the decals that we made were dirt and moss patterns. I'm looking forward to seeing what you do with these techniques. Thank you for watching.